Chapter 24. There are no accidents in the Great Way of Tao. Soldiers dragged me across the floor toward the throne, upon which sat the Duke of Jin, and thrust my face forward so that it practically touched the terrible mask. A hissing sound came from the mouthpiece as the clammy mind crawled over mine, and then the golden tiger jerked back. The great and powerful Duke of Jin was terrified. Saliva trickled from the mouthpiece, and the gold-mesh gloves trembled upon the arms of the throne, and an acrid stench of fear stung my nostrils. "I see the 3 handmaidens," the metal voice whispered. "I see the ball, and the bell, and the flute. I see the legs, and the arms, and the head of power." The Duke was trembling so hard that his cloak of feathers fluttered, as if for flight. But he finally forced himself to lean forward once more. The slimy brain moved fearfully over mine, and then I sensed relief and growing joy. "But I do not see the birds or the feathers or anything else of importance," he said wonderingly. "I see only those useless children in the right quest for the wrong reason. You and your antiquated companion have followed paths that cannot be followed, defeated guardians that cannot be defeated, escaped from places where escape was impossible, and you have not the slightest idea of what you were really doing, or where you were really going, or why." Now the metal voice had held a cruel, gloating pleasure. "You have managed to annoy me, and you shall discover what it means to annoy the Duke of Jin." The mask moved to the soldiers. "Take the old man and the boy to the torture chambers. They shall die by inches in the shirts of iron," he commanded. Only the Duke could have ordered such an execution, and I hasten to point out that in every other part of China the shirts of iron had long been relegated to museums, and that displayed the ghastly aberrations of the Dark Ages. Actually, they weren't made from iron at all, but from steel mesh that can be uniformly tightened by means of a neck loop or a screw in the back. The shirts are tightened around the victim's bare torso until flesh bulges through the holes in the mesh. And then the executioner picks up something hard and rough, a rock will do, and slowly scrapes across the shirt until there are no bulges. The flow of blood is carefully stopped, and the next day the shirt is shifted slightly, and the process is repeated. And the next day, and the next. A competent executioner can keep a victim alive for months, and the only hope the victim has is that he will go stark staring mad fairly early in the game. Li Kao and I had been wrapped in so many chains that we couldn't move a finger, and the soldiers groaned under the weight as they carried us down a seemingly endless flight of stone steps. I counted 11 landings, each one guarded by more soldiers. The air grew thicker and fouler, and slimy green water dripped from the black stone walls. Finally, we reached the bottommost dungeons. Brass-bound doors crashed open, and the panting soldiers carried us into a torture chamber that was decorated with blood and entrails. The executioner did not view us with friendly eyes. He was a fat fellow with a bald gray skull, a bright red nose, 4 yellow teeth, and a grievance. "Work, work, work," he snarled as he bustled around us with a tape measure. "Do you realize that each shirt of iron must be individually tailored for the victim? Do you realize that it takes 2 full days to make a decent one? Do you realize that the Duke has ordered me to finish your shirts in 2 hours? And then I have to give you your first scraping, and do you realize that a decent job of scraping takes another 2 hours? He stepped back and leveled an indignant finger. "Look at those chains," he snarled. "Do you realize that it will take another hour just to unlock, unwrap, rewrap, and relock those things? And do you realize that the Ancestress has ordered me to draw and quarter another prisoner? And do you realize that a decent job of drawing and quartering takes another 2 hours? When am I to rest, I ask you? Is there no pity? Is there no concern for the welfare of the working man?" He was not the only one with a grievance. "How about us?" the soldiers yelled. "We have to stand guard in this slimy hole until the prisoners die. And if you're halfway decent at your job, that will take months. and that crud of a master sergeant refused to issue earplugs and will be stone deaf from the screams inside of a week. Look at those cockroaches. Look at those leeches. Look at that slimy dripping water. There's fever down here as sure as you're born. And even if we live to return to our wives, what good will it do us? The Duke made us wrap those poor bastards in so many chains that they can't move, and carry them down 11 flights of stairs, and quadruple hernias have made eunuchs of us all. It appeared to be a day of grievances. "Whoa!" somebody howled as feet pattered down the stairs. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" wailed the key rabbit as he trotted into the torture chamber. "The Duke has ordered me to be present at the torture of my dearest friend, and the most generous protector that my dear wife has ever had, and to make a full report of their sufferings. Good evening, Lord Liavkow. Good evening, Lord Lu of Yu. It is delightful to see you again. But how can the Duke do this to me?" The little fellow posed dramatically, one forearm across his brow, and the other hand outflung. "I become violently ill in butcher shops," he howled. "I faint when I cut my finger. Crimson sunsets make me dive beneath the bed. Bloodhounds drive me into screaming fits. I once threw up all over a very distinguished nobleman who introduced me to his blood brother. I disgraced myself at a state banquet when I was informed that I was eating blood pudding. And now I must witness the bloodiest execution ever invented by man. Whoa!" wailed the key rabbit. "Whoa! Whoa! Whoa!" "Damn it, get out of the way and let a man work," the executioner snarled. He began to bang furiously on strips of steel mesh, and the soldiers panted and groaned as they carried us into an adjoining dungeon and dumped us upon the floor. They staggered out, clutching their hernias, and slammed the door, and we stared at the fellow who was to be drawn and quartered. He was attached to the wall with a leg chain, and he was eating a bowl of rice. "What are you doing here?" Master Li asked. "At the moment I am eating my last supper," said Henpecked Ho. "Good evening, Li Cow. Good evening, Number 10 Ox. It is a great pleasure to see you again, although one rather regrets the circumstances. May I offer you some rice? They have even given me a small jar of wine. Quite decent of them, don't you think?" "Wine, by all means," said Li Cow. Henpeck Ho's leg chain was just long enough for him to reach us and pour wine down our throats. They really were treating him with consideration, because it was very expensive wine, Wu Fan, which is jet black and so sweet that it tastes like molasses flavored with engraving acid. "Have you really been sentenced to be drawn and quartered?" I asked. "It's a very distressing story," he sighed. "Do you remember that I had spent 16 years trying to decipher fragments of clay tablets?" "A very ancient ginseng fairy tale," said Master Li. "Precisely. And do you remember that those grave robbers dug up a very large clay tablet? Well, it turned out to be the key to the whole thing. I could scarcely believe how quickly the pieces fell into place, and the story that emerged was so interesting that I could scarcely wait to see what came next. Then one day I entered my workshop and discovered that every clay fragment was gone. And I ran around weeping and tearing my hair until my dear wife told me to stop making a fool of myself. The ancestors had remarked that fiddling with clay tablets was a frivolous hobby for a grown man, so my dear wife had ordered the servants to dump the tablets into the river, where, of course, they dissolved into mud." "I would have slit her miserable throat," Master Li growled. "Indeed you would have. And I thought about you a great deal," said Henpecked Ho. "And you had advised me to use an axe. So I stole an axe and went after my dear wife." Did you get to her? Did you get her?" I asked. "I chopped her into pieces, and then I chopped her 7 fat sisters to pieces. It was delightful," said Henpecked Ho. "Then I came here to try and chop the ancestress to pieces, but her soldiers caught me first. Oh well, I suppose that one can't have everything." "Oh, you did splendidly," Master Li said. "Do you really think so? Some people might consider my behavior rather gross," Henpecked Ho said dubiously. "I was maddened beyond endurance, because now I will never know how the story came out, and it concerned 2 delightful deities that I had never heard of, even though I am familiar with the entire heavenly pantheon." Li Cow thoughtfully chewed a wisp of his scraggly beard, which was about all the movement that he could manage. As a matter of rather academic curiosity, have you ever encountered a deity called the Peddler? He wears a robe covered with heavenly or supernatural symbols. He leads upon a crutch, and he carries a flute and a ball and a bell. The Peddler is not one of the 600 named gods, but our knowledge of the pantheon is incomplete, Ho said thoughtfully. It must be remembered that the first Duke of Qin destroyed the temples and priests and worshippers of any cult that annoyed him, and knowledge of many minor deities disappeared from the face of the earth. The Peddler may have been among them, and I am mortally certain that the two delightful deities in the story on the tablet also suffered the Duke's displeasure. After all, peasants treasure ginseng fairy tales, and they would never willingly abandon a story about the handsomest god in heaven, and the most beautiful girl in the world, and a crown and 3 feathers and— "What?" Master Li yelped. "And a crown with 3 feathers, and 3 faithless handmaidens?" Well, I don't know about faithless, but 3 handmaidens were indeed briefly mentioned. Their names were— let's hear it in sequence, said Master Li. Your unmatched memory has surely retained every word, and I cannot imagine a better way to pass the time before being tortured to death than to listen to a fairy tale. Would you really like to hear it? Henpecked Ho said eagerly. I had so hoped to be able to share it with somebody, and perhaps my years of labor won't have been wasted after all. Even in half-completed form, it's a very good story. One of my clearest memories of the whole baffling affair is that of lying upon a dungeon floor, wrapped in chains from my neck to my toes, listening to the gentle voice of Henpecked Ho, while the executioner banged upon our shirts of iron in the next room. It was, as Henpecked Ho promised, quite a good story. Long ago, there was a little girl who lived in a little village with her loving parents. Her name was Jade Pearl. One day the village was raided by bandits, and Jade Pearl was picked up and carried off by a bandit who thought that he might be able to sell her, and several days later they reached a beautiful city. But the bandits were recognized and had to run away, and in the confusion Jade Pearl managed to escape. The little girl wandered into a park where beautiful flowers were growing, and Jade Pearl sat down beside the loveliest plant of them all and began to weep. Now, this was a very long time ago, before men had recognized the ginseng plant for what it was, and the lovely plant beside Jade Pearl was nothing less than the Queen of Ginseng. The Queen listened to the sobs of the frightened girl, and her heart was moved. And when Jade Pearl uncovered her eyes, she looked up and saw to her astonishment that a tall woman with a cheerful brown face and laughing eyes was smiling kindly at her. "Little girl, are you lost?" the Queen asked. Jade Pearl told the kindly woman what had happened, so far as she understood it, and the Queen of Ginseng took her by the hand and told her not to worry, because she was going home. Many days later they reached the little village, and the little girl's parents ran out joyfully to greet her, but when Jade Pearl turned to introduce the kindly lady who had brought her home, the Queen had vanished into thin air. The Queen returned to the other plants that grew in the beautiful city, but after a while she realized that she had grown very fond of the little girl and would like to see her again. One day Jade Pearl heard somebody call her name, and she ran into a bamboo grove, and there was the kindly lady with the laughing eyes. The Queen became the little girl's godmother and visited her often, and it was because of the contact with ginseng that Jade Pearl grew in health and comeliness. By the time she was 18, she was the most beautiful girl in the whole world, although she did not know it, and it was then that she had another marvelous visitor. During the rainy season in heaven, the great river of stars is filled with raging water. The young god, who is called the Star Shepherd, must stride through the waves day and night, guiding the stars to safety with his long shepherd's crook. But during the dry season he is free to travel as he pleases. One day during the dry season the Star Shepherd decided to visit Earth, so he floated down from heaven and landed beside a small village. He wandered around, admiring the sights, and then he came to a lovely grove of bamboo, and he found a path and strolled inside. In the center of the grove was a clearing where wildflowers grew, and in the center of the clearing was a pool where tiny fish of many colors swam, and in the center of the pool was a peasant girl who was bathing. Her skin was ivory brushed with honey, and her eyes were black almonds flecked with gold, and her hair was a cloud of soft swirling smoke, and her lips were ripe and full and bursting with sweetness, like plums. There were many other items of interest about the peasant girl, and you may be sure that the Star Shepherd didn't miss any of them. "Oh!" cried Jade Pearl, as she saw a face reflected in the water, and when she looked up, the most beautiful girl in the world was gazing at the handsomest god in heaven. One thing led to another, as it usually does, and one day in heaven an old retainer, who had been granted the right to fish in the great river of stars, came panting into the palace of the emperor and demanded an audience with the august personage of Jade. "Your heavenly majesty, the rainy season is upon us, but the Star Shepherd has not returned from earth," he wailed. "The great river is filled with wild waves, and terrified stars are crashing into the great black rocks, and many are badly damaged, and some have even sunk." The august personage of Jade could not believe that his favorite nephew would so neglect his duties, but he rushed outside to see for himself, and when he saw that it was just as the old retainer had said, he uttered a great roar of rage, and flew down to earth, and landed with a terrible clap of thunder in the middle of the bamboo grove. The emperor grabbed the Star Shepherd by the hair, and swung him around like a toy on the end of a string, and then he hurled him clear up to the constellation Aquila. "Back to your duties, you insolent puppy," he roared. "I swear by the name of my predecessor, the heavenly master of the first origin, that never again will you be allowed to visit Earth." Then he turned to Jade Pearl. "On your knees, strumpet," he yelled. "Prepare to face the wrath of heaven." Jade Pearl fell upon her knees and clasped her hands together. "Your heavenly majesty, there is no need to punish poor Jade Pearl," she sobbed. "I have given my heart to the Star Shepherd, and if I am never to see him again, I shall die." The august personage of Jade took a close look at Jade Pearl and remembered that he too had once been young. He took a second look and remembered that only recently he had sworn that the Star Shepherd had more common sense in his little finger than his other nephews had in their whole bodies. He took a third look, and he began to think deep thoughts about his beloved wife, the Queen Mother Wang, who used more powder and paint with less effect than any other woman he had ever known. He took a fourth look and said, 10,000 curses! The emperor sighed and sat down beside the pool, and after a moment he patted the grass beside him. "Come sit here beside me, my child," he said. So the peasant girl sat down beside the Emperor of Heaven, and he took off his sandals, and they dangled their feet in the water. The emperor watched tiny gold and scarlet fish glide around his toes like brightly painted snowflakes, and then he said, "Jade Pearl, I have sworn upon the sacred name of the heavenly master of the first origin that the Star Shepherd will never again be allowed to visit Earth. That oath cannot be broken." Jade Pearl began to weep bitterly. "Well, you should see what that boy did to the great river of stars," the emperor yelled. "Every hospital in heaven will be filled with broken stars for at least 6 months, and you don't know what misery is until you try to bandage a broken star." Jade Pearl continued to weep, and the emperor's eyes softened as he looked at her. Finally he shrugged his shoulders and muttered, "I'm going to regret this. I feel it in my bones." Then he reached into the left sleeve of his robe and pulled out a small golden crown. "Peasant girl, since the Star Shepherd cannot visit you on earth, I will allow you to visit him in heaven," he said. "Your Majesty honors me far beyond my worth," cried Jade Pearl. "That is precisely true, and I do not want to think of what will happen when my beloved wife, the Queen Mother Wang, finds out about it," he muttered grimly. "However, Heaven could use a little brightening up, and you have at least confirmed my suspicion that the Star Shepherd is the most sensible of my nephews." The Emperor cheered up at another thought. Besides, my wife owes me something after that disgraceful affair with her blasted peaches of immortality, and Chang-O and that loathsome white rabbit that keeps twitching his nose at me when I fly past the moon. Take my advice, young lady, and stay away from rabbits. The august personage of Jade reached into the right sleeve of his robe and pulled out 3 tiny white feathers, which he carefully placed upon the rim of the crown. "What day is it?" he asked. "Your Majesty, it is the 7th day of the 7th moon," said Jade Pearl. "Very well," said the Emperor. "Jade Pearl, these are 3 feathers from the kings of birds. So long as you wear them on your crown, you will be Princess of Birds, and all the birds of China will be your loving subjects. I hereby decree that on the 7th day of the 7th moon you will be allowed to summon the birds, who will build a bridge for you to climb, so that you may rejoin the Star Shepherd in heaven. But it is illegal for one who has not completed the full cycle around the great wheel of transmigrations to spend a full year in heaven. On the 1st day of the 1st moon you must summon the birds once more, and they will build the bridge that will return you to earth. And on the 7th day of the 7th moon you will be allowed to climb once more to heaven. And so it will continue throughout eternity, because if the Star Shepherd doesn't give you the peach of immortality, he's a greater fool than I think he is." The august personage of Jade waggled a finger in front of the peasant girl's nose to emphasize the importance of what he was saying. "Jade Pearl, do not forget the 7th day of the 7th moon. The conditions will be entered in the Imperial Book of Etiquette, which not even I am allowed to disobey, and if you fail to return to the Star Shepherd on the appointed day, you will pass from the protection of heaven." "The Imperial Book of Etiquette does not allow for excuses," the Emperor said urgently. "The gods will be forbidden to help you, and none but a mortal can restore you to heaven, and at a conservative estimate the odds against somebody pulling off a trick like that are once in 10,000 billion trillion. Do you understand me?" "I hear and obey," Jade Pearl whispered. So the peasant girl knelt before the Emperor of Heaven, and he placed the little gold crown upon her head. "Arise, Princess of Birds," he commanded, and when Jade Pearl stood up, she was astonished to see that she shone with a divine light. "Call your subjects," the Emperor commanded, and when she called to the birds, a great song of joy arose, and all the birds of China came flying toward their princess. They carried green twigs and branches, and with these they built a bridge that stretched up to the stars. Jade Pearl climbed the bridge to heaven, and the Star Shepherd married the Princess of Birds, and gave her the peach of immortality, and on the 1st day of the 1st moon they parted with many tears, and the beautiful bridge of birds returned Jade Pearl to earth. Heaven saw to it that her little village lacked for nothing, so that the princess could spend her time singing songs and weaving daisy chains. She had 3 girls from her own village as handmaidens, Snow Goose, Little Ping, and Autumn Moon. And she had a goat and a cat and a little dog to help her pass the time. Still, it seemed an eternity before the 7th day of the 7th moon arrived. Jade Pearl kissed her handmaidens and bowed to her parents. Then she called to the birds, and the peasants of China gazed up in wonder and delight as the bridge of birds ascended to the stars, and the Princess of Birds ran to the arms of the Star Shepherd, and they lived. Henpuk Ho sighed and shrugged. "Happily ever after," he said. "You see, that's as far as I had gone when my dear wife had the fragments destroyed. If they lived happily ever after, I cannot imagine why half of the tale remained to be deciphered, although at some point it would most certainly have returned to ginseng lore. What do you think, Li Kao? "Oh, they did not live happily ever after, and I strongly suspect that your tablets did not preserve an ancient fairy tale," Master Li said grimly. When history crumbles into dust, the events of history are sometimes preserved in the form of myth or fable, and I am rash enough to believe that if Ox and I can get our hands on one or two more missing pieces, we will have the solution to a rather baffling puzzle. Li Kao chewed thoughtfully on his beard, and then he said, "Ho, Ox and I are wrapped in so many chains that we can't move. You are attached to the wall by a leg chain. The dungeon is solid rock. The torture chamber is crammed with soldiers. We are 11 stories beneath the earth, and each landing is guarded by more soldiers. The palace is swarming with the army of the Ancestress. The army of the Duke of Qin is camped outside the walls, and Ox and I must escape from here immediately. Unless you look forward to being drawn and quartered, I suggest that you accompany us." "I think that's a splendid idea," said Henpecked Ho.